You speak English? Can you even read the drink menu? Or do they just hire anyone who smiles and looks pretty? Michael Harrison's condescending voice carried through first class as he snapped his fingers at the Latina flight attendant, dismissing her like she was furniture with a pulse. I asked for Scotch neat 5 minutes ago. Are you too stupid to understand basic drink orders? Or is this job just too complicated for someone like you? What Michael didn't know, what this arrogant hedge fund manager flying from Miami to New York was too busy being xenophobic to notice, was that the dumb flight attendant he'd been verbally abusing for the past hour was actually Dr. Sofia Morales, one of Venezuela's top interventional cardiologists who performed over 3,000 heart surgeries before immigrating to the United States, where her medical credentials weren't recognized and serving drinks at 30,000 feet was the only job she could get while desperately trying to validate her medical license. And what Michael definitely didn't realize was that in approximately 15 minutes, his own heart would try to kill him mid-flight. And the only thing standing between him and death would be the stupid woman who can barely speak English, whose medical expertise far exceeded most American-trained doctors, the bro. You see, I was actually on that exact flight, heading back to New York after wrapping up a security consultation project in Miami. And I watched this whole toxic interaction unfold from my seat in 3C. I noticed Sofia immediately when I boarded because there was something about how she moved through the cabin that reminded me of doctors. I worked with on medical facility security projects, purposeful, efficient, constantly assessing. The way she checked an elderly passenger's color when bringing water, how she positioned herself to support a pregnant woman struggling with overhead luggage. These were inactions of someone just going through the motions of a service job. This was someone with medical instincts, so deeply ingrained they operated automatically, Before I tell you how Michael's medical emergency revealed that the incompetent flight attendant he'd been tormenting was actually more qualified to save his life than most emergency room physicians, let me ask you something that probably hits different for a lot of folks watching this. Have you ever witnessed someone treating service workers, flight attendants, servers, retail employees like they're beneath them based on accent, appearance, or assumptions about education? Drop your city and country in the comments and tell me about times you've seen people dismiss workers who turned out to be incredibly qualified professionals, doing survival jobs because their credentials aren't recognized in America. Because what happened on Flight 1447 that December afternoon is gonna show you exactly why you should never judge someone's intelligence or capabilities based on the job they're currently doing to pay bills. And hey, real quick, I gotta give a shout out to Maria Rodriguez from Phoenix, Arizona, and James Chen from Seattle, Washington, who've been commenting on our previous videos, sharing their own stories about underestimated immigrants. Maria, your story about the janitor, who was actually an engineer in Cuba, really resonated. And James, appreciate you sharing how your parents, who were doctors in Taiwan, had to start over in restaurant work. Y'all keep those stories coming. They matter. And they remind people that human dignity isn't determined by job titles, bro. Now, if you'll pardon an old man for taking a moment here to settle into this story. Cases where highly educated immigrants end up in survival jobs while trying to navigate impossible credential validation systems always hit me in a particular way. At my age, having worked security in medical facilities, airports, and corporate environments for decades, I've met countless people serving coffee or cleaning floors who have more education than the executives looking down on them. Thank you for staying with Uncle Sam as I tell you about one of the most dramatic demonstrations I ever witnessed of why assumptions about people based on their current circumstances can be spectacularly, life-threateningly wrong. To understand how Dr. Sofia Morales ended up serving drinks on commercial flights, despite being a world-class cardiac surgeon. We gotta go back about 4 years to when her life in Venezuela became untenable, and she made the desperate decision to leave everything behind. Her thriving medical practice, her reputation as one of Caracas's most skilled interventional cardiologists, her entire professional identity, to seek safety and stability in the United States. Sofia had been born in Maracaibo in 1979, growing up in a middle-class Venezuelan family during the country's more prosperous years. Her father was a pharmacist, her mother a nurse, and Sofia had been drawn to medicine from childhood. The kind of kid who bandage her dolls and create elaborate hospital scenarios in her room. She'd excelled academically, earning admission to Universidad Central de Venezuela's medical school at age 17. Graduating at the top of her class 6 years later. Her residency in cardiology had been completed at Hospital Universitario de Caracas, one of Venezuela's premier teaching hospitals, where she trained under some of Latin America's most respected cardiac surgeons. Sofia had specialized in interventional cardiology, the complex procedures where surgeons access the heart through small incisions using catheters and imaging technology, fixing problems without open heart surgery. It required exceptional hand-eye coordination, three-dimensional spatial reasoning, the ability to make split-second decisions under pressure, and years of intensive training that most doctors never pursued. By 2015, at age 36, Sofia had established herself as one of Venezuela's leading interventional cardiologists. She'd performed over 3,000 cardiac catheterizations, hundreds of angioplasties, dozens of complex valve repairs, and had published research in international cardiology journals. Her patient outcomes were exceptional. Complication rates well below national averages, success rates that rivaled the best cardiac centers in the world. She'd built a practice at a private hospital in Caracas, training younger cardiologists while maintaining her own surgical schedule. Asterisk, asterisk, I love my work, Sofia had told me during our conversation after the flight incident. Every day I was saving lives, solving complex cardiac problems, teaching the next generation of Venezuelan cardiologists. I'd spent 15 years building expertise and reputation, and I was exactly where I'd always dreamed of being professionally. But Venezuela's economic and political collapse had made continuing that life impossible. By 2018, the country's healthcare system had deteriorated catastrophically. Hospitals lacked basic supplies. Medications were unavailable. Electrical grids failed regularly, causing surgical equipment to shut down mid-procedure. And violence had made even getting to work dangerous. Sofia's hospital had been raided multiple times by armed groups looking for drugs and medical supplies. Colleagues had been kidnapped. Patients had died from lack of basic antibiotics. And the professional medical practice she'd spent her career building had become unsustainable. The breaking point came when I lost a patient because we didn't have the stents I needed for an emergency angioplasty. Sofia had explained, her voice still carrying the trauma of that moment. A 42-year-old man having a massive heart attack, and I had the skills to save him but not the equipment. He died on my table because Venezuela's medical system had collapsed. So completely that basic cardiac supplies were available. After that, I knew I couldn't stay. Sofia had left Venezuela in early 2019, joining the mass exodus of professionals fleeing the country's humanitarian crisis. She'd entered the United States on a tourist visa, intending to apply for asylum while trying to validate her medical credentials so she could continue practicing cardiology. She'd brought her diplomas, her surgical records, her publications, her letters of recommendation from respected cardiologists' documentation that an irrational system should have allowed her to quickly demonstrate her expertise and resume her medical career. What Sofia discovered was that the United States medical licensing system, designed primarily to protect American doctors from foreign competition while theoretically ensuring quality standards, made it nearly impossible for internationally trained physicians to practice. Even when their qualifications and experience matched or exceeded American standards, I had to pass the USMLE exam for the United States Medical Licensing Examination, which is reasonable, Sofia had explained. But those exams cost thousands of dollars per attempt, require months of study even for experienced physicians because they're designed for American medical education. And passing them is just the first step. Then you need to complete an American residency, which is 3 to 7 more years of training, even though I'd already completed residency and practiced for 15 years in Venezuela. The residency requirement is where the system really blocks foreign doctors, Sofia had continued. There are limited residency spots in the US, and they're primarily filled by American medical school graduates. International medical graduates compete for maybe 10% of available positions, and the competition is fierce. I applied to 73 cardiology residency programs with my 15 years of experience and 3,000 procedures, and received 0 interviews. They saw foreign medical graduate and Venezuelan training, and didn't even consider my application. Meanwhile, Sofia had added with bitter irony, I'm watching news stories about doctor shortages in America, about rural areas that can't find cardiologists, about patients dying because they can't access cardiac care. And I'm sitting here, a fully trained, highly experienced interventional cardiologist unable to practice because the system assumes foreign training is automatically inferior to American training, regardless of actual qualifications or outcomes. Sofia's asylum application had taken 2 years to process, during which she couldn't legally work and survive on savings that rapidly depleted. When she finally received her work authorization in 2021, she'd been desperate for any income while continuing to study for the USMLE exams and apply for residency programs that consistently rejected her. She tried working as a medical assistant, but even those positions required American certifications she didn't have. She'd offered to work as a volunteer in hospitals, hoping to demonstrate her skills, but liability concerns prevented that. I was running out of money, my savings were gone, and I needed work immediately, Sofia had explained. A friend suggested applying to airlines they were hiring. The pay was decent. My customer service skills from working with patients transferred well, and I spoke English fluently. So Dr. Sofia Morales, interventional cardiologist who'd performed 3,000 heart surgeries, became Sofia the flight attendant who serves drinks and demonstrates safety procedures. The cognitive dissonance of that transition from saving lives through complex cardiac procedures to serving beverages at 30,000 feet had been psychologically devastating. Sofia would work her flights, then go home and study cardiology journals to maintain her medical knowledge, practice catheter techniques on simulation equipment she'd bought with credit cards, and apply to residency programs that never responded. She'd been doing this for 3 years by the time Flight 447 departed Miami for New York on that December afternoon. I'd boarded the flight around 2 p.m., settling into my aisle seat in row 3, where I had good sight lines of the first-class cabin. Old security habits die hard, and I'm always aware of my environment even during routine travel. Sofia had been working the first-class section, moving through her pre-flight duties with efficiency that I denoticed immediately because it reminded me of medical professionals I'd worked with. Michael Harrison had boarded about 10 minutes before departure, immediately establishing himself as the kind of passenger that flight crews dread. He complained about the temperature, criticized the seat configuration, demanded that his luggage be handled more carefully, and generally treated the crew like personal servants whose sole purpose was anticipating his needs. When Sofia had approached to take his drink order, Michael had looked at her with the kind of contempt that some people reserve for service workers they view as beneath them. "You speak English?" Michael had asked, his tone making it clear this wasn't a genuine question, but rather a prejudiced assumption that the Latina flight attendant might not be competent in English. "Can you even read the drink menu, or do they just hire anyone who smiles and looks pretty?" Sofia had maintained professional composure despite the obvious insult. "Yes, sir, I speak English fluently. What can I get you to drink?" "Scotch, neat, top shelf," Michael had replied dismissively, already returning his attention to his laptop like Sofia's presence wasn't worth his time. "And try not to spill it like whoever trained you probably does." The interaction had made my jaw tighten. I've spent decades watching how people treat service workers. And Michael, casual cruelty was the kind that reveals character more accurately than any resume or professional accomplishment. Sofia had simply nodded and moved to prepare his drink. Her expression neutral, but her body language carrying the tension of someone absorbing yet another microaggression in a long series of them. Over the next hour, as the flight progressed, Michael had continued his pattern of disrespectful treatment towards Sofia. When she'd brought his scotch, he'd complained it wasn't the right brand, despite her confirming she'd poured exactly what he'd ordered. When she'd offered snacks, he'd made comments about whether she could understand the English names of the items. When she'd asked if he needed anything else, he'd responded with competent service would be nice, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Excuse me," I said to Sofia quietly when she passed my row after one of Michael's particularly harsh comments. "I'm sorry you're dealing with that. You're doing a great job, and that guy's behavior says everything about him and nothing about you." Sofia had smiled slightly, the kind of tired smile that suggested she'd heard similar comments before and appreciated the support, even if it didn't change her situation. "Thank you. Some passengers are more challenging than others, but it's part of the job. For what it's worth," I'd added. I've worked in enough professional environments to recognize when someone is overqualified for the position they're in. "Whatever your background is, I'm guessing flight attendant doesn't capture it." That had gotten a genuine smile, and Sofia had paused briefly. Let's just say I had a different career before this one. "But bills need to be paid, and this is what was available." I had nodded understanding. I'd had enough conversations with underemployed immigrants over my career to recognize the pattern. Highly educated professional forced into service work because American credential validation systems made continuing their actual careers impossible. The waste of human capital is staggering, and the psychological toll on people who spent decades building expertise only to serve drinks or clean offices must have been crushing. The flight had continued normally for another 30 minutes. Passengers settling in for the 3-hour journey to New York. Michael had ordered another scotch. Continuing his pattern of treating Sofia with dismissive contempt, she'd maintained her professionalism, responding to his rudeness with courtesy that probably required significant self-control, given her actual qualifications and his obvious ignorance. Then, About 90 minutes into the flight, somewhere over South Carolina, Michael had made a comment to Sofia about the meal service being slow, adding something about maybe you should try a job that doesn't require thinking, and then he stopped mid-sentence. His expression suddenly shifting from arrogant irritation to confused distress. "Are you all right, sir?" Sofia had asked immediately, and I noticed her body language change instantly from flight attendant to something else, more alert, more focused, scanning his appearance with what I now know was clinical assessment. My chest feels tight," Michael had said, his voice losing its earlier confidence, like pressure. "And my left arm is tingling." Sofia had moved instantly, her entire demeanor transforming. "Sir, I need you to stay calm. Can you describe the chest pressure? Is it sharp or crushing? Does it radiate to your jaw or shoulder?" The questions had been specific, medical, delivered with authority that had nothing to do with being a flight attendant, and everything to do with someone who diagnosed heart attacks thousands of times. Michael had looked confused by the shift in her tone, but he'd been too uncomfortable to resist. "Crushing," he'd managed. "Heavy, radiating to my jaw and down my left arm. I can't. I feel dizzy." "He's having a heart attack," Sofia had said to the senior flight attendant who'd approached when she'd noticed the commotion. "We need to get him lying down immediately. Oxygen if available. And I need the emergency medical kit. Alert the pilots we have a cardiac emergency and ask if there's a doctor on board." The senior attendant had looked surprised at Sofia's decisive medical assessment, but had moved quickly to follow her instructions. Within seconds, Sofia had helped to move Michael to a clear area at the front of first class, positioning him on his back, loosening his collar and tie, and beginning a rapid physical assessment that looked nothing like standard first aid, and everything like emergency room evaluation. "Sir, I need you to listen carefully," Sofia had said, her voice calm but commanding. "You're having a myocardial infarction, a heart attack. I'm going to help you, but I need you to stay calm and follow my instructions exactly. Can you do that?" Michael had nodded weakly, all his earlier arrogance evaporated in the face of genuine medical crisis and sudden awareness that the dumb flight attendant he'd been abusing was now the only thing standing between him and possible death. The senior flight attendant had returned with oxygen and the emergency medical kit, and I'd heard her relay to Sofia that the pilots had made an announcement asking if any physicians were on board. 2 passengers had responded. One was a dermatologist, the other a podiatrist. Both had approached the scene, and I'd watched their expressions as they'd observed Sofia's clinical assessment and confident handling of the situation. "Dr. Rodriguez, dermatology," one had said. "Do you need assistance?" "I've got it," Sofia had replied without looking up from her assessment of Michael's, "but thank you." "I'm Dr. Morales, interventional cardiology. I've handled thousands of these." The dermatologist had looked surprised but had stepped back, watching as Sofia had worked with the efficiency of someone who'd done exactly this countless times before. She'd gotten Michael on oxygen, administered aspirin from the emergency kit, positioned him to optimize blood flow, and was monitoring his pulse and respiration while asking detailed questions about his medical history. "Do you have history of cardiac disease?" Sofia had asked rapidly. "High blood pressure, high cholesterol, previous heart issues? Are you on any medications?" "Blood pressure medication," Michael had managed between labored breaths. "Cholesterol medication. My father died of a heart attack at 53. I'm 51. Classic risk profile," Sofia had muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "Sir, your symptoms suggest an acute coronary syndrome, likely STEMI street elevation myocardial infarction. Part of your heart muscle isn't getting adequate blood flow, probably due to a blood clot blocking one of your coronary arteries. We're 300 miles from the nearest airport, at least 45 minutes from landing even if we divert immediately. Am I going to die?" Michael had asked, fear finally breaking through completely. "Not if I can help it," Sofia had replied with confidence that came from having faced exactly this scenario hundreds of times. "But I need to monitor you carefully. If your heart rhythm becomes unstable, I may need to perform emergency procedures to keep you alive until we land." The senior flight attendant had been on the radio with the pilots, and I'd heard fragments of the conversation about diverting to Charleston, South Carolina, the nearest major airport with cardiac facilities. Sofia had been consulting with ground-based emergency physicians via the plane's medical communication system, providing detailed assessments that made clear to anyone listening that she wasn't just someone with first aid training. She was a physician with deep expertise in cardiac emergencies. We need to be prepared for the possibility that his heart rhythm destabilizes, Sofia had told a senior attendant quietly. If he goes into ventricular fibrillation or cardiac arrest, I'll need to use the AED, and I may need to perform chest compressions. Clear the area around him and make sure we have easy access to all emergency equipment. Then, about 15 minutes into Sofia's management of Michael's heart attack. Exactly what she'd anticipated happened. The portable monitor from the emergency kit showed Michael's heart rhythm beginning to deteriorate. What had been regular if stressed heartbeats started showing irregular patterns that I recognized even from my limited first aid training as dangerous. He's going into VFib, Sofia had announced. Her voice sharp with urgency but not panic. Ventricular fibrillation? His heart's electrical system is failing. We need to shock him immediately, or he'll die. The next 60 seconds had been the most intense I'd witnessed on any flight in 40 years of traveling. Sofia had grabbed the AED automated external defibrillator, charged it following the device's automated instructions, made sure everyone was clear of Michael's body, and delivered an electrical shock to his chest that had made his body convulse and drawn gasps from nearby passengers. Still VFib, Sofia had said, checking the monitor. Charging again. Everyone clear. Second shock. This time, when Sofia had checked the monitor, her expression had shown relief. We've got sinus rhythm, normal heartbeat restored, but it's unstable. He could deteriorate again at any moment. For the next 25 minutes until the plane made an emergency landing in Charleston, Sofia had maintained constant monitoring of Michael's cardiac status, her hands never leaving his pulse points, her eyes constantly moving between his face and the portable monitor. She'd talk to him steadily, keeping him conscious and calm, explaining what was happening in terms he could understand, while also demonstrating the kind of bedside manner that comes from years of treating terrified cardiac patients. You're doing well, Sofia had reassured Michael during a moment when his fear was visible on his face. Your heart rhythm is holding stable. The aspirin is helping prevent further clotting. We're minutes from landing, and there's a cardiac team waiting for you. You're going to survive this? I'm sorry, Michael had whispered, his voice weak but carrying genuine remorse. For how I treated you. For the things I said. You're saving my life. We'll talk about it later, Sofia had replied, not unkindly but focused on his medical condition rather than his apologies. For right now, you need to conserve your energy and stay calm. Your heart has been through trauma, and every stress makes it work harder. The plane had touched down in Charleston 17 minutes later, and paramedics had boarded immediately to transport Michael to the nearest cardiac center. Sofia had provided them with detailed handoff information, timeline of symptoms, interventions she'd performed, his vital signs throughout the emergency. His medical history she de-extracted, delivering the kind of comprehensive report that emergency physicians give each other, not what flight attendants typically provide. One of the paramedics had looked at Sofia with obvious respect. You're a physician? Cardiologist, Sofia had confirmed. Interventional cardiology, 15 years of practice. I've managed probably 500 heart attacks over my career. Then this guy's lucky you were on his flight, the paramedic had replied. Your assessment and interventions are probably why he's still alive. The VFib episode alone could have killed him if you hadn't shocked him immediately. After the paramedics had taken Michael, the plane had needed to sit in Charleston for 2 hours while the airline arranged for a replacement crew. FAA regulations required the original crew to have extended rest after the stress of a medical emergency. During that time, several passengers had approached Sofia to thank her, to express amazement that a flight attendant had such extensive medical expertise, to ask how someone with her qualifications ended up serving drinks on commercial flights. I'm a Venezuelan trained cardiologist, Sofia had explained to a cluster of curious passengers. I've performed over 3,000 cardiac procedures in my career. But in the United States, my medical credentials aren't recognized. I can't practice medicine here without completing an American residency, which is years of additional training despite my experience. So I work as a flight attendant to pay bills while I study for licensing exams and apply to residency programs that consistently reject me because I'm a foreign medical graduate. The passengers' expressions had ranged from shock to outrage to sadness. One woman, a nurse, had shaken her head in frustration. So you're telling me we have a doctor shortage in this country, And we remaking a highly experienced cardiologist serve drinks because of bureaucratic barriers to recognizing foreign medical training? That's insane. That's the system, Sofia had replied with weary acceptance. There are thousands of foreign trained doctors in the United States working as medical assistants, home health aides, drivers, cleaners, jobs that don't require medical licenses because we can't get our credentials validated. Meanwhile, Americans die from lack of access to physicians, particularly specialists like cardiologists. The waste of human capital is staggering. I'd approached Sofia during this conversation, introducing myself and explaining that I'd worked security in medical facilities throughout my career and understood exactly what she was describing. We talked for about 20 minutes about her journey from respected cardiologist in Venezuela to flight attendant in America, the impossible barriers of the credential validation system, the psychological toll of being professionally erased despite having expertise that could save lives. The hardest part, Sofia had told me, isn't the financial struggle or even the loss of status. It's knowing that I have skills that people desperately need, that I've spent my entire adult life developing expertise in saving cardiac patients, and I'm legally prohibited from using that expertise to help people. Today was the first time in 3 years I've been able to actually practice cardiology, and it happened because someone was literally dying and there's no one else more qualified available. Does Michael know? I asked. I mean, does he understand that the woman he was calling stupid and mocking for her English is actually more qualified than most American cardiologists? I don't think he's processed it yet, Sofia had replied. He was too focused on not dying. But yeah, eventually he'll have to confront that the dumb flight attendant he was degrading has more medical expertise than almost anyone he knows. And she saved his life despite him treating her with contempt for an hour before his heart attacked him. Now, before I continue with what happened after Michael was treated at the Charleston Hospital and how this story eventually impacted Sofia's career trajectory, let me pause here real quick. If you finding value in this story about a cardiologist forced to work as a flight attendant while trying to validate her credentials, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Uncle Sam has got tons more stories about highly qualified immigrants doing survival jobs while facing discrimination from people who have no idea who they actually dismissing. And drop a comment telling me if you've ever witnessed or experienced similar situations, skilled professionals, working jobs that don't match their qualifications because of credential barriers, visa restrictions, or systematic obstacles to using their actual expertise. Because these stories matter, and knowing we're not alone in recognizing this waste of human potential makes a difference, you know? Michael had spent 4 days in Charleston's cardiac center, where doctors had performed an emergency angioplasty to clear the blocked coronary artery that had caused his heart attack. The procedure had involved exactly the kind of interventional cardiology that Sofia specialized in, accessing his heart through his femoral artery, threading a catheter up to the blocked coronary vessel, inflating a balloon to compress the plaque, and placing a stent to keep the artery open. If you'd gone into full cardiac arrest on that plane, Michael's cardiologist had told him your survival chances would have been maybe 15%. The fact that the flight attendant recognized you were having a heart attack immediately, administered appropriate first aid, and most critically defibrillated you when you went into fib, that's why you're alive. She performed exactly the interventions I would have done if I'd been there. She said she's a cardiologist Michael had managed from his hospital bed, from Venezuela. But she's working as a flight attendant because her credentials aren't recognized here. That's unfortunately common, the cardiologist had replied. We have a physician shortage in this country, particularly for specialists, while highly qualified foreign doctors work service jobs because our medical licensing system makes it nearly impossible for them to practice. I've met several international medical graduates working as medical assistants or technicians who have more experience than some of my American-trained residents. That conversation had apparently hit Michael hard, because when he'd been released from the hospital and returned home to New York, one of his first actions had been trying to contact Sofia to apologize and thank her properly. He'd reached out to the airline, explaining the situation and asking how he could get in touch with the flight attendant who saved his life. The airline had been cautious about sharing employee contact information, but they'd agreed to forward Michael's message to Sofia and let her decide whether to respond. His message had been surprisingly humble for someone who'd been so arrogant during the flight, acknowledging his terrible behavior. expressing genuine gratitude for her medical intervention, asking if there was anything he could do to help her navigate the medical licensing process. Sofia had been skeptical about responding initially. Why should I help someone who spent an hour treating me like garbage just because his heart attack forced him to recognize I'm actually a human being with expertise? She told me during a phone conversation weeks later. His apology doesn't undo the humiliation or change the fact that he only values me now because I saved his life. That's fair. I agreed. You don't owe him anything. But pragmatically, he's a wealthy hedge fund manager who's feeling guilty and grateful, which means he might actually have resources to help you navigate the credential validation system in ways that advocacy groups can't. Worth at least hearing what he's offering before you decide. Sofia had eventually agreed to meet Michael for coffee in Manhattan, primarily out of curiosity about what he thought he could offer. Their conversation had lasted 3 hours, with Michael candidly acknowledging his xenophobic behavior and explaining that the heart attack had forced him to confront prejudices he held unconsciously. Assumptions that accented English meant limited intelligence, that service workers were less educated or capable than professionals that his own. Credentials and wealth made him superior to people in lesser jobs. I was a complete asshole to you, Michael had said bluntly during that conversation. The worst part is that I didn't even recognize. I was being awful because I genuinely believed that flight attendants were just people who couldn't do anything more demanding. The cognitive dissonance of discovering you were actually a world-class cardiologist who was serving me drinks. While I insulted your intelligence, it's forced me to examine a lot of ugly assumptions I didn't even know I had. Apology accepted, Sofia had replied. Though I want you to understand that what you did to me happens constantly to immigrants working service jobs. We're doctors, engineers, lawyers, scientists in our home countries, and in America, we clean offices or serve food while people like you treat us as stupid because we have accents or brown skin. Your awakening came because your life depended on recognizing my expertise, but most immigrants never get that dramatic vindication, which is why I want to help, Michael had said. Not just you specifically, though I definitely want to help you get your medical license validated, but more broadly, I want to do something about the systematic barriers that keep qualified foreign doctors from practicing. It's just both morally wrong and strategically stupid for America to waste this medical expertise while we have doctor shortages. Michael's connections and resources had proven surprisingly useful. He de-hired an immigration attorney who specialized in medical licensing issues to work with Sofia on her credential validation. He'd made introductions to administrators at several hospitals who were interested in hiring international medical graduates if they could be credentialed. He'd funded Sofia's USMLE exam fees and study materials. And perhaps most valuably, he'd used his business connections to get meetings with medical board officials to discuss the systematic obstacles facing foreign-trained physicians. Over the following 18 months, Sofia had finally made progress that had eluded her for years. She passed all 3 USMLE exams on her first attempts, something only about 60% of test takers accomplish, demonstrating that her medical knowledge met or exceeded American standards despite her foreign training. She secured a cardiology fellowship at a hospital in New Jersey that had an established program for placing international medical graduates, allowing her to get the American clinical experience that licensing boards required. The fellowship means another 3 years of training. Sofia had explained to me during a celebratory dinner after she'd received the acceptance. But it's at attending physician salary since I'm already a fully trained cardiologist. And more importantly, it's a pathway to being able to actually practice medicine again. 3 more years of what's essentially recertification, and then I can finally do what I was trained for. That's still absurd that you have to redo years of training you already completed, I'd observed. But at least it's movement forward after being stuck in limbo. The airline had been understanding about Sofia leaving her flight attendant position, particularly given that her story had generated significant positive publicity for them once it had become public. Several news outlets had covered the flight attendant who's actually a heart surgeon story, which had sparked broader conversations about underemployed immigrants and the waste of professional talent that occurs when credential validation systems create impossible barriers. Dr. Sofia Morales represents thousands of highly educated immigrants who are driving Ubers, cleaning offices, or working retail because American licensing systems don't recognize their foreign credentials. One editorial had noted, "We complain about doctor shortages while making it nearly impossible for qualified foreign physicians to practice. The irony of a Venezuelan cardiologist serving drinks on planes while Americans die from lack of cardiac care access should shame us into reforming these barriers. Michael had used his platform and resources to advocate for medical licensing reform, partnering with immigrant rights organizations to push for streamlined processes that would allow foreign-trained doctors to demonstrate competence without repeating years of training they'd already completed. The advocacy work had been partially self-interested. Michael's cardiac rehabilitation required ongoing specialist care, and his doctor had pointed out that increasing the supply of cardiologists would improve access and reduce costs for everyone. I'm not suddenly an immigration advocate because I've become enlightened about social justice. Michael had admitted during a panel discussion about medical licensing reform. I am pushing for these changes because I had a heart attack that was successfully managed by a foreign-trained cardiologist who could legally practice medicine. And that made me recognize how stupid our current system is, even from a purely selfish perspective. America needs more doctors. We have thousands of qualified foreign doctors already in the country, and we're preventing them from practicing based on bureaucratic barriers rather than actual competence. 3 years after the flight incident, Sofia had completed her fellowship and obtained her American medical license, finally able to practice interventional cardiology again after a 6-year gap. She joined the cardiology practice at a hospital in Brooklyn, bringing her 15-plus years of experience to treating patients who desperately needed cardiac care. Her first day back in a catheterization lab, actually performing the complex procedures. She'd been trained for rather than just serving drinks or studying from afar, had been emotional in ways she'd struggled to articulate. I'd forgotten what it felt like to use my expertise to save lives rather than just survive. Sofia had told me during a conversation after her first week back in practice to be recognized as Dr. Morales instead of Sofia, the flight attendant. To walk into a patient's room and have them trust me with their cardiac care rather than ask me for another drink. It's like reclaiming a part of my identity that had been forcibly taken away. Asterisk, asterisk. The hospital where Sofia practiced had been surprised by her extensive experience and exceptional clinical skills, particularly her ability to handle complex cases that intimidated younger cardiologists. Her patient outcomes were excellent, complication rates below national averages, success rates that matched or exceeded even elite cardiac centers. Within her first year, Sofia had become one of the most requested cardiologists on staff. With referring the hospital where Sofia practiced had been surprised by her extensive experience and exceptional clinical skills, particularly her ability to handle complex cases that intimidated younger cardiologists. Her patient outcomes were excellent, complication rates below national averages, success rates that matched or exceeded even elite cardiac centers. Within her first year, Sofia had become one of the most requested cardiologists on staff, with referring physicians specifically asking for her when they had difficult cases that required advanced interventional expertise. Dr. Morales has hands that I've only seen in surgeons with 20-plus years of experience. Her department chief had commented during a performance review. Her catheter technique is exceptional. Her decision-making under pressure is flawless, and her patient rapport is outstanding. Honestly, she's outperforming cardiologists who trained at Harvard and Hopkins. Whatever training system Venezuela used produced a world-class interventional cardiologist. That assessment had validated what Sofia had known all along, that her Venezuelan training. And 15 years of practice had made her an expert cardiologist whose skills matched or exceeded American-trained physicians. The years she'd spent serving drinks while studying for validation exams hadn't been because she lacked competence. They'd been because systematic barriers assumed foreign training was automatically inferior. Regardless of actual qualifications or outcomes, Michael had remained grateful and involved in Sofia's career trajectory, though their relationship had evolved from patient-doctor to something closer to colleagues advocating for the same reform goals. His hedge fund had donated substantial money to organizations working on medical licensing reform, and he'd leveraged his business connections to bring attention to the issue of underemployed foreign professionals. The irony, Michael had reflected during one of his advocacy speeches, is that Americans like me talk constantly about wanting the best doctors, the most qualified specialists, the highest quality medical care. But our licensing system actively prevents highly qualified foreign doctors from practicing, forcing them into service jobs while we complain about physician shortages. It took my own heart attack being managed by a cardiologist who was serving me drinks to recognize that contradiction. And honestly, Michael had added, I'm ashamed that it took a life-threatening emergency to make me see Dr. Morales as the highly educated professional she'd always been rather than as the dumb flight attendant I'd been insulting. That says terrible things about my character and my assumptions about people based on their current job rather than their actual capabilities. I'm trying to do better, but I am also realistic that one dramatic wake-up call doesn't automatically undo decades of privilege and prejudice. 5 years after the flight incident, Sofia had become director of interventional cardiology at her hospital, overseeing a team of cardiologists and training fellows in the complex procedures she mastered over 2 decades of practice. She had also become an advocate for reforming medical licensing barriers, speaking publicly about her experience in pushing for policy changes that would make it easier for qualified foreign physicians to practice in the United States. There are an estimated 15,000 foreign-trained doctors in the United States who are working as medical assistants, drivers, cleaners, or other jobs that don't require medical licenses. Sofia had explained during a congressional testimony about medical licensing reform. These are fully trained physicians with years or even decades of experience who could be treating patients, addressing our physician shortage, and improving healthcare access, particularly in underserved areas that desperately need doctors. The barriers aren't about protecting quality, Sofia had continued. I had to prove my competence by passing the same exams as American medical graduates, completing additional training and demonstrating clinical skills. The barriers are about protecting American doctors from competition and maintaining a system that assumes foreign training is inferior regardless of evidence. That's not quality assurance, it's protectionism that hurts patients by limiting their access to qualified physicians. The testimony had been part of broader advocacy efforts that were finally generating some legislative movement toward reforming medical licensing barriers. Several states had begun implementing streamlined processes for internationally trained physicians, recognizing that the traditional requirements of repeating entire residencies was wasteful when doctors had already completed equivalent or superior training elsewhere. Dr. Morales' story resonated because it was so dramatic, explained Senator Maria Rodriguez, who had been pushing for medical licensing reform. The image of a cardiologist serving drinks while Americans die from lack of cardiac care access is powerful. But she represents thousands of less visible cases. The Iraqi engineer driving Uber, the Syrian lawyer cleaning offices, the Filipino nurse working as a home health aide because American licensing boards won't recognize their credentials. We're wasting tremendous human capital while complaining about workforce shortages. As I reflected on Sofia's journey years after that flight, I remained struck by how one medical emergency had exposed such fundamental contradictions in how America treats immigrant professionals. Sofia had always been a world-class cardiologist. Her skills and knowledge hadn't changed between Venezuela and the United States. What changed was whether bureaucratic systems recognized and validated those skills, and whether people like Michael could see past service worker uniforms to recognize the expertise beneath. You know what I think about constantly? Sofia had told me during one of our periodic catch-up conversations. All the other immigrant professionals working service jobs right now who won't get the dramatic vindication I got. The ER doctor from Syria driving for Uber, who will never have a passenger go into cardiac arrest at the exact moment that proves his expertise. The civil engineer from Honduras working construction who will never face a structural crisis that demonstrates his qualifications. They're just as skilled as I am, but they'll never get that movie moment proof that they're more than their current job suggests. That's why the advocacy work matters, Sofia had continued. Because reforming these licensing barriers isn't about my individual success story. I eventually got through the system, even though it took 6 years of my career, an immense psychological toll. It's about the thousands of others who might not make it through, who might give up and accept that their professional expertise will never be recognized in America. who'll spend their careers underemployed despite having skills we desperately need. The airline industry had also been impacted by Sofia's story, with several carriers implementing policies to better track and utilize professional backgrounds beyond their current job duties. The logic was pragmatic. If you had flight attendants who were trained physicians, paramedics, or nurses, you wanted to know that in advance so they could be deployed appropriately during medical emergencies, rather than discovered accidentally when someone nearly died. We found that about 8% of our flight crew had medical training beyond basic first aid. One airline executive had explained during an industry conference. Doctors, nurses, paramedics working as flight attendants or gate agents, because it was stable employment with benefits while they pursued credential validation or dealt with visa restrictions. We've created a database now so we know which crew members have advanced medical skills. And we try to ensure flights have at least one person with that background when possible. The policy had practical benefits beyond just medical emergencies. The airline had discovered that employees with advanced medical training had lower stress responses during emergencies, better assessment skills for passenger issues, and often provided superior customer service because their medical backgrounds had taught them patience and communication skills. What had initially seemed like wasted professional talent, doctors serving drinks, actually enhanced crew capabilities in ways the airline was now actively utilizing. Michael Dust's perspective on immigration and professional qualifications had fundamentally shifted following his heart attack and subsequent advocacy work with Sofia. His hedge fund had begun specifically recruiting analysts and associates from immigrant communities, recognizing that people who navigated complex visa systems, credential validation barriers, and professional reinvention often had exceptional problem-solving skills and work ethic. The cognitive flexibility required to restart your career in a foreign country, learn new regulatory systems, and succeed despite systematic barriers, those are exactly the skills that make excellent financial analysts. Michael had explained to his partners when someone questioned the hiring strategy. Dr. Morales was a cardiologist, then a flight attendant, then fought through impossible licensing barriers to become a cardiologist again. That kind of resilience and adaptability is more valuable than any Ivy League degree. The hiring approach had proven successful, with several immigrant hires becoming top performers who brought diverse perspectives and exceptional determination to their roles. Michael Dest's hedge fund had become known in immigrant communities as an employer willing to look past credential gaps or unconventional career paths to recognize actual capabilities and potential. As for Michael personally, his brush with mortality had created lasting changes beyond just his views on immigration and professional licensing. He'd become more conscious of how he treated service workers, more willing to engage people as individuals rather than as functions of their current job, more aware that assumptions about education or intelligence based on accents or appearance were often spectacularly wrong. I still catch myself making snap judgments. Michael had admitted during a conversation seeing someone in a service role and unconsciously assuming they'd be less educated or capable than white-collar professionals. But now when I notice those thoughts, I remember that the woman serving my drinks might be a heart surgeon, and my assumptions reveal my ignorance rather than their limitations. It's ongoing work to unlearn decades of privilege and prejudice. 7 years after the flight incident, Sofia had been promoted to chief of cardiology at our hospital, overseeing not just the interventional program, but the entire cardiac service line. At age 51, she rebuilt the career that had been interrupted by Venezuela's collapse and 6 years of credential validation struggles. Her patient outcomes remained exceptional. Her advocacy work was influencing policy at state and federal levels, and she trained dozens of fellows who were now practicing cardiologists themselves. Sometimes I think about the parallel universe where I stayed in Venezuela and continued practicing without interruption. Sofia had reflected during an interview for a medical journal. I'd probably have performed 5,000 procedures by now instead of 3,500. I'd have trained more cardiologists. I wouldn't have lost 6 years of my career serving drinks and fighting bureaucratic barriers. But I also wouldn't have the perspective I gained from being professionally erased and having to rebuild from nothing. Sofia had added, I understand now what immigrant professionals face when their credentials aren't recognized. I know what it is like to be dismissed as incompetent by people who have no idea what you're actually capable of. And that lived experience informs my advocacy in ways that would be impossible if I did just read about these barriers rather than experiencing them personally. The medical licensing reform movement that Sofia and others had been pushing had finally achieved some significant victories. Several states had passed laws creating streamlined licensing pathways for internationally trained physicians who could demonstrate equivalent competence through exams and supervised practice rather than repeating full residencies. The reforms were imperfect. They still required validation rather than simple recognition of foreign credentials, but they represented meaningful progress toward reducing barriers. We're not arguing that foreign training should be automatically accepted without verification. Sofia had explained during advocacy work. Standards matter, and patients deserve assurance that their doctors are competent regardless of where they trained. But the current system that requires foreign physicians to repeat training they've already completed, often for longer periods than American graduates, isn't about quality assurance, it's about limiting competition. What we're pushing for is competency-based assessment, Sofia had continued. Let foreign doctors prove they can perform at American standards through rigorous testing and supervised practice. If they demonstrate equivalent or superior skills to American-trained physicians, as I did by passing all licensing exams on first attempt and performing complex procedures that younger cardiologists couldn't handle, then let them practice. The barriers should be about capability, not about protecting domestic doctors from competition. The reforms were gradually increasing the supply of practicing physicians in the United States, particularly in specialties like cardiology, where shortages were most severe. States that had implemented streamlined licensing for international medical graduates were seeing measurable improvements in physician availability, particularly in rural and underserved areas where immigrant doctors were more willing to practice than American medical graduates who preferred urban centers. We've added about 60 new physicians to our state through the reformed licensing pathway. One state medical board director had reported, these are experienced doctors who passed rigorous competency assessments and who are now practicing in communities that had been medically underserved for years. Several of them are specialists we desperately needed. Cardiologists, neurologists, oncologists, who would have continued driving Ubers or cleaning offices under the old system. As I listened to Sofia share her story during a medical conference where she'd been invited as keynote speaker, I thought about how one flight, one medical emergency, and one arrogant executive's heart attack had exposed systematic injustices that affected thousands of immigrant professionals. Sofia guessed dramatic vindication. The dumb flight attendant, revealed as an expert cardiologist, had created a narrative hook that drew attention to issues that advocacy groups had been highlighting for decades. Without gaining traction, Dr. Morales' story worked because it had a clear villain and a dramatic reversal, explained Dr. James Chen, an immigrant rights advocate. Michael Harrison insulting Sofia's intelligence, then needing her medical expertise to survive, that gets a narrative that people understand emotionally even if they don't follow policy debates about medical licensing. But Sofia represents thousands of less dramatic cases where the injustice is just as real but lacks that cinematic moment of recognition. The challenge now, Dr. Chun had continued, is translating the attention from Sofia's individual story into systematic reform that helps all the other foreign-trained professionals working service jobs despite their qualifications. We've made progress, but we're still wasting tremendous human capital because our credential validation systems are built more around protectionism than around actually assessing competence. Sofia had used her platform to amplify those less visible stories, profiling other immigrant professionals in her advocacy work and congressional testimony. The Syrian e-doctor driving Uber, the Ethiopian civil engineer working construction, the Filipino nurse's aide who'd been a nurse educator in Manila, the Iraqi microbiologist cleaning labs instead of working in them. Each story illustrated the same fundamental contradiction: America, complaining about workforce shortages while preventing qualified immigrants from using their expertise. These aren't isolated cases. Sofia had emphasized during her advocacy. The Migration Policy Institute estimates there are millions of college-educated immigrants in the United States working jobs that don't require degrees because of credential barriers, visa restrictions, or language discrimination. That's millions of people whose skills are being wasted because our systems are built around assumptions that foreign training is inferior rather than around actually assessing whether people can do the work. 10 years after the flight incident, Sofia had been invited to speak at medical schools about alternative career pathways and the reality of being an immigrant physician. Her talks were popular with international medical students who were trying to understand what they'd face after graduation, and with American students who never considered the barriers their international colleagues would encounter. The key message I want you to understand, Sofia had told a packed auditorium at Columbia Medical School, is that medical competence isn't determined by where you trained or what accent you speak with or what your current job title is. I was the same cardiologist whether I was performing surgeries in Venezuela, serving drinks on an airplane, or practicing in Brooklyn. What changed was whether systems and people recognized and valued that competence. For international medical graduates here, Sofia had continued, understand that the barriers you'll face aren't about your qualifications. You'll be just as skilled as American graduates, often more so because you've had to overcome additional obstacles. The system is broken and we're working to fix it, but in the meantime, know your worth and don't internalize the discrimination you'll encounter as evidence that you're somehow less capable. And for American medical students, Sofia had addressed the other portion of her audience. Recognize that your international colleagues aren't getting easier paths or lower standards. They're facing additional barriers that you'll never experience. When you meet an immigrant doctor who is working as a medical assistant or who took extra years to get licensed, understand that they likely have more experience and resilience than most American trained physicians. They're assets to our profession, not threats to your careers. The speech had received standing ovation, with dozens of students, both international and American, approaching Sofia afterward to thank her for articulating experiences that often went unacknowledged in medical education. Several international students had been in tears, expressing relief that someone with Sofia's credentials and success was validating their struggles and frustrations with a system that treated them as automatically inferior. As I sat in my modest apartment in Queens finishing my lunch break and preparing to head back to my security consulting work, I reflected on how Sofia's story had influenced my own perspective over the decades since I witnessed that emergency on Flight 447. I'd always been conscious of how people treated service workers, having spent my career in security roles that many people viewed as low status. But Sofia's experience had made me even more aware of the gap between people's current jobs and their actual qualifications. Now, when I encountered flight attendants, Uber drivers, cleaners, food service workers, anyone in roles that society often dismissed as low skill, I found myself wondering about their backgrounds. What had they done before this job? What languages did they speak? What credentials didn't American systems recognize? What expertise were they using despite working jobs that didn't officially require it? You know what the wildest thing is? My lunch companion Roberto had said when I'd finished telling him Sofia's story. Roberto worked in the mailroom of the same corporate building where I consulted on security. And we developed a friendship over shared lunch breaks where we trade stories about workplace dynamics and human nature. What's that? I asked. You're telling me this story about a cardiologist serving drinks. And it doesn't surprise me at all, Roberto had replied, because I'm a mechanical engineer from Colombia. I designed industrial vac systems for 15 years before I came to the US. Now I push mail carts and people treat me like I'm incapable of complex thought. But at least once a month, something breaks in this building and the maintenance team can't figure it out. And I end up diagnosing and fixing it because I understand the systems better than the people who are officially employed to maintain them. Have you tried getting your engineering credentials validated? I'd asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. For 8 years, Roberto had confirmed, but the Professional Engineers Licensing Board requires that I redo 4 years of education through an American engineering program to validate my Colombian degree, plus pass multiple exams that cost thousands of dollars, plus complete work experience under a licensed American engineer who will supervise me. It's designed to be impossible for foreign engineers to actually get through. Meanwhile, Roberto had added with weary irony, this building has engineering problems constantly that American-trained engineers either can't solve or solve expensively. Last month, they were going to tear out an entire section of ductwork because consultants said it was unfixable. I spent an hour with the flashlight and fixed the airflow issue that was causing the problem. Saved the company about $40,000. Got thanked by my manager. Still push mail carts for $18 an hour. That conversation had reinforced everything ID learned from Sofia. America was filled with underemployed professionals whose expertise was being wasted because credential validation systems prioritized protectionism over pragmatism. Roberto wasn't unique. Sofia wasn't unique. They represented thousands, maybe millions of immigrants whose qualifications were recognized by systems built to maintain professional monopolies rather than to actually assess competence. Well, Roberto, I'd said, checking my watch and seeing that our lunch break was ending. We should probably get back to work before someone decides to lecture us about productivity. But I appreciate you sharing your story. Makes me realize that Sofia's dramatic heart attack rescue was just the visible tip of a massive iceberg of wasted talent and underutilized expertise. That's exactly right, Roberto had agreed, standing and gathering his lunch containers. For every dramatic moment where an underemployed professional gets to demonstrate their real skills, there are thousands of quiet daily moments where we bite our tongues and pretend. We do know better while watching supposed experts struggle with problems we could solve in minutes. Tomorrow I can tell you about another story if you want. I'd offered as we'd walked toward the elevators. Got a situation I witnessed in Vegas, where a bartender who everyone assumed was just mixing drinks turned out to be a trauma nurse from the Philippines, who stopped a guy from bleeding out when he cut his arm on broken glass. Ambulance was stuck in traffic, and this bartender basically performed emergency surgery with the limited supplies available behind the bar. I'd love to hear it, Roberto had replied. These stories matter, Sam. They remind people like me that we're not crazy for feeling undervalued, and maybe they open some eyes among Americans who never thought about what the service workers around them might have done before they ended up serving, you know? That's the goal, I'd agree. Bro, if we don't tell these stories, people keep assuming that jobs are accurate reflections of capabilities rather than reflections of circumstantial barriers and systemic obstacles. Sofia serving drinks wasn't about her lacking medical skills. It was about America refusing to recognize those skills. Your pushing mail carts isn't about you lacking engineering expertise. It's about professional engineering boards protecting domestic engineers from competition. Exactly, Roberto had said as we'd reached the elevator bank. And maybe if enough people hear these stories, something changes. Maybe not for us. I'm 53 and I've made peace with pushing mail carts until retirement. But maybe for the next generation of immigrant professionals, the barriers won't be quite as impossible. As I had ridden the elevator back up to the corporate floors where my security consulting work waited, I'd thought about how to end my retelling of Sofia's story in a way that captured both the specific drama of that flight incident and the broader systematic issues it exposed. The narrative had everything: arrogant executive getting instant karma, dramatic life-saving intervention, credential validation struggles, eventual professional success, advocacy leading to policy reform. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about how many other Sofias were out there, working jobs that didn't match their qualifications while America complained about professional shortages. So what do you think about how we treat immigrant professionals and the barriers we create to recognizing foreign credentials? Have you ever witnessed situations where service workers revealed unexpected expertise? Or met highly educated immigrants working survival jobs because American licensing systems won't recognize their qualifications? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments, bro. Tell me what city and country you rewatching from and share any experiences with underemployed immigrants or credential validation struggles, because these conversations matter and they remind people they're not alone in facing these systematic obstacles. Sofia's story shows that sometimes it takes a life-threatening emergency to force recognition of expertise that should have been valued all along. But ideally, we wouldn't need dramatic cardiac arrests on airplanes to understand that the person serving your drinks might be more qualified than the doctor you're repaying hundreds of dollars to see. We wouldn't need immigrant professionals to save lives in crisis moments before we recognize that our credential validation systems are wasteful, discriminatory, and harmful to everyone who needs access to qualified professionals. Because at the end of the day, America has a choice. We can continue maintaining protectionist barriers that keep foreign-trained doctors driving Ubers while Americans die from lack of physician access. We can keep requiring engineers to push mail carts despite having expertise that could improve infrastructure and innovation. We can waste the tremendous human capital that immigrants bring while complaining about workforce shortages. Or we can reform these systems to actually assess competence rather than just protecting domestic professionals from competition, you know? Sofia got through eventually. 6 years of serving drinks, thousands of dollars in exam fees, 3 additional years of fellowship training, despite already having 15 years of cardiology experience. She's now saving lives again, training the next generation of cardiologists, and advocating for reforms that will help other immigrant professionals navigate barriers she faced. But how many potential Dr. Morales are still serving drinks, driving cars, cleaning offices, working jobs that waste their expertise because the path she took was so difficult that most people couldn't complete it? That's the question American policymakers need to grapple with. Not whether individual immigrants can eventually overcome impossible barriers through exceptional persistence, but whether those barriers serve any legitimate purpose beyond protecting domestic professionals from competition. Because Michael Harrison nearly died on that airplane, and the only thing that saved him was a cardiologist to America. Medical licensing system said wasn't qualified to practice medicine. That contradiction should tell us something important about whether credentialing systems are actually about quality or just about protectionism. Bro, I've worked security for over 40 years, seen thousands of workplace situations, documented countless interactions between people at different levels of organizational hierarchies. And one thing I've learned absolutely for certain people, current job titles are terrible predictors of their actual knowledge, skills, and capabilities. The flight attendant might be a cardiologist. The mail clerk might be an engineer. The Uber driver might be a lawyer. The janitor might be a surgeon. And Americans who judge people based on their service jobs rather than engaging them as individuals are not just being rude. They missing opportunities to learn from expertise that's hiding in plain sight. So next time you interact with service workers, flight attendants, servers, drivers, quitter, remember that you don't know their background, their qualifications, or what they were before systemic barriers forced them into survival jobs. Treat them with respect, not because they might turn out to be secretly highly educated, though they might be, but because every human being deserves basic dignity regardless of their current occupation. Michael Harrison learned that lesson the hard way when his heart attacked him, and he discovered that treating people with contempt might literally cost you your life if you need their expertise to survive, you know? Anyway, bro, our lunch break is over. And I got to get back to my security consulting before someone decides I'm not working hard enough and tries to lecture me about professionalism. Though honestly, after decades in this field, I do love to see them try might remind them that the security guard they read dismissing has forgotten more about threat assessment and crisis management than most executives will ever learn. But that's a conversation for another day. Tomorrow, if we run into each other in the cafeteria, remind me to tell you about the ski resort situation in Colorado, where a lift operator everyone thought was just some uneducated mountain bum turned out to be an orthopedic surgeon from Colombia who prevented a tourist from becoming paralyzed after a bad fall. You really cannot be amazed at how many of these stories I've witnessed over the years. Highly qualified. Immigrants doing whatever jobs they can get while Americans judge them without having any idea who they actually talking to. It'll be a real pleasure if we meet here again tomorrow, bro. And hey, these stories, they're not just entertainment. They're reminders that human potential shows up in unexpected places. That assumptions about people based on current circumstances are often completely wrong. And that treating everyone with dignity isn't just morally right, but practically wise because you never know when you might need the expertise of someone you've been dismissing as beneath you. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you tomorrow with another story about the hidden credentials all around us that most people never notice until crisis forces recognition, you know?